My name is James Richardson. I'm 39 years old, and I grew up in a house haunted by a man I never met. His name was Thomas Richardson, and according to the story my family told, he was a decorated Army officer who died in service when my father was just 8 years old. My grandmother raised three sons alone after that, working as a teacher, making sacrifices, building a life from the wreckage of his death. My father inherited this narrative. He inherited the image of a father who'd died a hero, who'd given his life for his country, who'd never come home. My father built his entire identity around being the son of that hero. He built his values around that narrative. He built his sense of duty and responsibility around the idea that his father had taught him through absence what it meant to be a man. I grew up with photographs of my grandfather on the mantelpiece. I grew up with a man I'd never met, feeling like the most important person in my family's history. I grew up understanding that Thomas Richardson was a hero, that we were descendants of a hero, that we carried the legacy of sacrifice. My grandmother spoke about him with a certain quality in her voice that I learned over time to recognize as something complicated. It wasn't quite sadness. It wasn't quite anger. It was something in between, something she carefully controlled every time she mentioned his name. The first time I really paid attention to my grandfather was when I was 12 years old. My father had taken me to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. We were visiting for a family trip, and my father had wanted to take me to see the wall. We'd walked along the names, running our fingers over the carved letters. My father had shown me where to find Thomas Richardson, but when we looked, his name wasn't there. My father had seemed confused by that. He'd said something about the records being incomplete, about how some names weren't properly documented, about how the memorial wasn't perfect. I remember asking him if my grandfather had died in Vietnam, and my father had said no, that he'd died earlier in Korea. I remember thinking it was strange that my father seemed uncertain about which war his own father had died in. I remember thinking it was strange that he seemed relieved when we didn't find the name on the wall, but I was 12 years old and I didn't have the vocabulary to ask the questions I should have asked. So I let it go. I let the confusion go. I moved on to other things, and I carried the image of my grandfather forward with me, a man who died in a war, whose name wasn't on a wall, whose story I knew only through the way my family talked about him. My grandmother died when I was 28 years old. She died quietly, in the middle of the night, in her sleep, at the age of 94. She'd lived a long life. She'd seen her sons grow up, get married, have children. She'd seen me grow up. She'd watched me become a man, watched me become a journalist, watched me build a career around investigating stories and uncovering truths. And in all that time, she never told me the truth about my grandfather. After she died, my father asked me if I wanted to help him go through her things. I said yes. I went to her house, the house where my father had grown up, the house that was full of my grandfather's absence. We started sorting through boxes in the attic. We found old photographs, old letters, old documents, and in one of those boxes, tucked underneath some financial records from the 1950s, my father found a photograph he'd never seen before. It was a photograph of my grandmother and my grandfather. They were young in the photograph. They were smiling. My grandfather had his arm around my grandmother's waist. The photograph had a date on the back, 1956, which was 7 years after my grandfather was supposed to have died. My father stared at that photograph for a long time. He said, very quietly, "I think my mother lied to me." I said, "What do you mean? That's not possible. There's no way she would have." My father said, "Look at the date, James. Look at the photograph. My father is alive in this photograph. My father is alive in 1956. My mother told me he died in 1949. So either my mother took a photograph of a dead man or she lied about when he died." We found more photographs after that, more evidence. We found a postcard from my grandfather, mailed from California in 1963, asking my grandmother how the boys were doing. We found a letter addressed to my grandmother from my grandfather, dated 1971, talking about the weather in Sacramento, and asking if she was taking care of herself. We found bank records showing regular deposits that didn't match my grandmother's teacher's salary. We found evidence that my grandfather had been alive, that he'd been in contact with my grandmother, that he'd been sending money, that he'd been present in some way throughout a life my father had been told was fatherless. My father sat down on the attic floor, surrounded by boxes, surrounded by the evidence of a lie that had shaped his entire life, and he cried. He cried for the father he'd mourned who wasn't dead. He cried for the narrative that had been taken from him. He cried for the woman who'd told him that lie every single day of his childhood. He cried because his entire understanding of his past had just collapsed. I sat next to him, and I tried to process what this meant. I tried to understand why my grandmother would have told such an enormous lie. I tried to imagine the circumstances that would lead a woman to tell her children that their father was dead when he was actually alive. I tried to reconcile the woman I'd known, who was kind, who was loving, who was present, with the woman who'd perpetrated a lie that had echoed through 3 generations. We contacted a lawyer. My father wanted to understand what had happened. He wanted to know why his father had left, why his mother had lied, whether there were legal documents that explained anything. The lawyer was able to find records of divorce proceedings from 1948. My grandfather had filed for divorce from my grandmother. My grandmother had contested it. My grandfather had eventually dropped the case and disappeared. There was no formal custody agreement, no legal reconciliation. My grandfather had simply left. So that was the story, at least the legal version of it. My grandparents had been married. My grandfather had wanted to leave. My grandmother had fought to keep the marriage, and when she lost that fight, she'd told her children that he was dead. She'd rewritten history. She'd replaced the narrative of abandonment with the narrative of heroic sacrifice. She'd taken the shame of being left and transformed it into the dignity of being widowed. My father and I had to make a decision about what to do with this information. We had to decide whether to track my grandfather down, whether to try to contact him, whether to confront the woman my grandmother had been after she'd lied. We had to decide whether to tell my aunts and uncles, my cousins, my entire extended family, that the foundational story of our family history was false. My father decided that he wanted to find his father. He wanted to know what had happened. He wanted to understand why his father had left. He wanted to understand the man he'd spent his entire life mourning. I helped him. I used my skills as a journalist to track my grandfather down. It turned out that he'd lived in Sacramento, California for most of his life. He'd built a business. He'd married again. He'd had 2 more children. He'd lived an entire life that our family didn't know about. He'd lived a life that my grandmother had erased from our family history. When I found his address, my father looked at it for a long time. He said, "He's still alive?" I said, "I don't know. The records are recent, but that doesn't mean he's still living." My father said, "Do you think I should contact him?" I said, "That's up to you. But if you're going to do it, you should do it soon. He's 94 years old. If he's still alive, he might not be for much longer." My father wrote a letter. He spent days writing it. He wrote about his childhood. He wrote about growing up thinking his father was dead. He wrote about the confusion he'd felt, the way the absence had shaped him, the way he'd tried to honor a memory of a man he'd never met. He wrote about finding the photograph, about understanding that his mother had lied, about wanting to know the truth. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He just explained calmly what he'd discovered, and he asked if his father would be willing to talk to him. I mailed the letter for him. We waited. My father checked the mail every day for 3 weeks, and then a response came. It was a letter written in shaky handwriting, but it was a response. My grandfather was alive, and he wanted to talk. My father decided to fly to Sacramento. He decided to meet his father for the first time in his life. I didn't go with him. I thought that was something he needed to do alone. He was gone for a week. When he came back, he was different. He was quieter. He was processing something. He was grieving something that he'd already thought he'd grieved decades ago. He told me that my grandfather had explained everything. My grandfather had said that he'd married my grandmother too young. He'd said that they'd had children too quickly. He'd said that he'd felt trapped. He'd said that he'd wanted to live his own life. And he'd realized, at some point, that staying in the marriage was destroying both of them. He'd said that he'd tried to leave multiple times, but my grandmother had threatened to take his children away, had threatened to keep them from seeing him, had threatened to ruin him financially if he didn't come back. He'd said that in the end, he'd just left. He'd taken a job in California. He'd built a new life. He'd sent money. He'd stayed in contact with my grandmother, not out of love, but out of obligation, out of guilt, out of the understanding that his children existed. And he had a responsibility toward them, even if he couldn't be their father in the traditional sense. He'd said that he didn't know my grandmother had told his children he was dead. He'd said that if he'd known, he would have come back. He'd said that he would have fought that narrative. He'd said that he was sorry that his abandonment had been reframed as death, that his children had been denied the ability to know him, that they'd built their identities around a lie. My father said, "I don't know if I believe him. I don't know if he would have actually come back." But I understand now that my mother made a choice. She chose to tell a lie rather than deal with the complexity of the truth. She chose to make herself a widow rather than explain that my father had left. And that choice had consequences that rippled through 3 generations. My father spent the rest of his life building a relationship with his father. It was a strange relationship, built on decades of lost time, built on the understanding that his father had been absent not by death but by choice, built on the complicated forgiveness that comes from understanding that people are flawed and that sometimes they make decisions that hurt other people. My grandfather died 5 years after that first letter. My father was at his bedside. My father said that his father had told him he was sorry. My father said that he'd told his father he forgave him. Whether that forgiveness was earned, or whether it was just something my father needed to say, I don't know. But they got to have that conversation, which is more than my father would have had if his mother's lie had never been discovered. But the bigger question, the one that I've been wrestling with for years now, is the question of my grandmother's motivations. Was she lying to protect her children? Did she genuinely believe that telling them their father was dead was better than telling them he'd abandoned them? Or was she lying to control them, to keep them dependent on her, to maintain the narrative of being a martyr who'd sacrificed everything to raise them alone? I think the answer is probably both. I think my grandmother was probably motivated by a mixture of protective instinct and desire for control. I think she probably believed that her children would be hurt less if they mourned a dead father than if they felt the shame of having been abandoned. And I think she probably also enjoyed the narrative of being the strong woman who'd raised 3 boys alone, who'd sacrificed everything, who was owed gratitude and loyalty in return. The lie gave my grandmother a certain power. It made her indispensable. It made her a hero in the family narrative. It gave her a way to explain her children's pain that didn't require examining her own marriage, her own decisions, her own role in what had happened. The lie protected her from accountability. And the lie had consequences. It had consequences for my father, who'd spent his entire life being the son of a hero, who'd inherited a sense of duty that was based on a false narrative, who'd struggled with abandonment issues because he'd never had the chance to actually know his father. It had consequences for my uncles, who'd built their identities around being the sons of a man who died in service, who'd felt obligated to honor that memory through their own actions. It had consequences for an entire family that was shaped by a foundational lie. When I learned about this, I became obsessed with the idea of truth. I became obsessed with understanding how lies propagate through families, how they shape identity, how they create consequences that echo through generations. I became obsessed with understanding my grandmother's motivations. And I realized something important. I would never know for certain whether she lied to protect or to control. I would never know whether her intentions were noble or selfish, or some combination of both. And I had to make peace with that uncertainty. What I do know is that she chose to lie. She chose to tell her children that their father was dead when he was alive. She chose to maintain that lie for decades. She chose to carry that secret until her own death. And that choice had a cost. The cost was truth. The cost was the relationship that my father could have had with his father. The cost was the complexity of the full story, which is always more nuanced than any single narrative can capture. My father eventually reconciled with the loss of his father, not by mourning the father he'd never had, but by building a relationship with the man his father actually was. My father eventually understood that his father was a man who'd made selfish choices, but who'd also tried, in his own limited way, to stay connected to his children. My father eventually understood that his mother had made selfish choices too, and that the line between protection and control is sometimes impossible to distinguish. I think what my family story taught me is that lies don't protect people from pain. Lies delay pain. Lies transform pain into something else: shame, confusion, anger, distrust. Lies create the conditions for more lies. And the moment the truth comes out, all that delayed pain comes rushing back, but now it comes back complicated by the fact that you've also lost time, lost relationships, lost the ability to have had different conversations in the past. I became a journalist in part because of this story. I became obsessed with the idea of uncovering truth, of excavating the narratives that people tell about themselves and about their families, of understanding the ways that stories get constructed and reconstructed. I became obsessed with the idea that truth matters, that it's important to know what actually happened, even if what actually happened is complicated and painful. But I also learned that truth doesn't automatically fix things. When my father found out that his father was alive, it didn't fix the fact that he'd grown up without him. It didn't fix the decades of pain. It didn't fix the identity that had been built on a lie. It just gave him the information he needed to construct a new narrative. It gave him the opportunity to have a different relationship with his father. It gave him the chance to grieve what he'd lost in a way that was based on reality rather than fiction. My grandmother died carrying that secret. She died without ever acknowledging the lie to her sons. She died without ever explaining her motivations. She died without ever giving them the opportunity to ask her why. And I think that's part of why my father needed to find his father so badly. He needed to hear his father's version of the story. He needed to understand, as much as he could, what had actually happened. He needed to replace the fiction of a war hero father with the reality of a flawed man who'd made selfish choices. Years later, I did something that my father didn't do. I tracked down my grandfather's children, my aunts and uncles on that side of the family. I called them. I told them who I was. I told them the story of how my grandmother had told her children that their father was dead when he was actually alive. I told them that their father had tried, in his own way, to stay connected to his first family. I told them that my father had forgiven his father, and that I wanted them to know that there was another family out there that cared about their father too. They were kind to me. They invited me to visit Sacramento. They shared photographs of their father, of the life he'd built, of the man he'd been outside of my family's story. They told me that their father had been troubled by the lie, that he'd worried about his first family, that he'd tried to do what he could from a distance. They told me that they'd grown up hearing about their father's regret, about the sons he'd left behind, about the life he'd wanted to have if things had been different. And I realized something in listening to them. I realized that the lie didn't just affect my family. It affected his life too. It affected his ability to be a father. It affected his guilt. It affected the way he saw himself. The lie rippled outward in ways that neither my grandmother nor my grandfather could have controlled. This is what I want people to understand about family lies. I want people to understand that when you lie about someone's identity, about someone's past, about someone's origins, you're not protecting anyone. You're creating a false reality that everyone has to live in. And when that false reality eventually breaks down, and it will eventually break down, the consequences are devastating. My grandmother lied because she was hurt, because she was ashamed, because she wanted to control the narrative of her own life. My grandfather lied in his own way by staying away, by not fighting harder for his relationship with his children, by accepting the separation as a fait accompli instead of fighting to be part of their lives. And my father grew up in the space between those two lies, building an identity around a fiction, mourning a man who wasn't dead, struggling with abandonment that he'd never actually experienced, but that had been constructed for him by the adults around him. It took a photograph, hidden in a box in an attic, to start unraveling the lie. It took my grandmother's death to make it possible to ask questions. It took my father's courage to reach out to the father he'd never met. It took my family's willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to accept that sometimes the answers are complicated, to understand that people are flawed, and that sometimes those flaws have consequences that echo through generations. That's my story. One lie told decades ago. One photograph that proved the lie. One family rewritten in the aftermath of truth. The quiet victory is not that the truth came out. The quiet victory is that my father had the chance to build a relationship with his father before it was too late. The quiet victory is that my entire family understands now that we're capable of being deceived by the people closest to us, and that sometimes the only way forward is to accept the truth, no matter how painful it is, and to use that truth to build something better than the lie that came before.